Harold Fenwick. The year was 1953. He lived in a small house in Columbus, Ohio. It was October, a cold day, and his wife told Harold that their 10-year-old son Thomas didn't want to get out of bed on a Saturday morning. Harold walked into the room. He opened the curtains. Thomas squinted. Harold said one sentence. "I'll be waiting in the garden. You have 10 minutes." And he left. 10 minutes later, Thomas was in the garden. Here is a question for you. What did Harold Fenwick teach his son that morning? To get out of bed? I don't think so. That one thing is more important than another? Perhaps. That morning, Harold taught his son something that should be learned before the age of 10, but isn't even taught at 15 today. I won't tell you what that is just yet. Number 3 is the most important. Subscribe before you get to number 3. If you're over 45 and you've ever wondered when, how, and with what words a father teaches his son to become a man, this channel is exactly for you. Let's meet in the comments. 1. They taught what it means to give your word. It was 1951. Robert Mallory, who lived in Detroit, Michigan, had told his son James that summer that they would go fishing every Saturday morning. James was 8 years old. The first 2 Saturdays they went. The third Saturday, Robert woke up exhausted from a heavy work week. It was cold outside, and James was ready at 7 o'clock, standing at the door in his boots. Robert got up, got dressed. They went. They didn't catch any fish. The water was too cold. But they went. Robert said nothing. James asked nothing. But in an interview decades later, he said this: "My father didn't teach me to fish that morning. He taught me to keep my word, and he did it without ever explaining it." Columbia University psychologist Walter Mischel, in research he began in the 1960s that continued for years, studied the effect of reliability modeling on children. The findings were clear. Children of parents who kept their word developed far stronger interpersonal trust capacity in later life compared to children of parents who did not. That is, the child learned reliability not as a value but as a behavior. And this learning happened not through explanation, but through observation. Modern parenting delivers every promise with a "if possible" caveat. We'll see, maybe, if the weather is nice. And the child learns words are flexible. They can change. They depend on conditions. When he grows up, he gives his own words the same way. Robert Mallory got up and got dressed on a cold morning. James didn't catch any fish that day, but he saw his father, and what he saw gave him the life lesson he would need for 50 years. 2. They showed what it looks like to own a mistake by making one themselves. In 1954, George Aldrich, who lived in Wichita, Kansas, had offered one Sunday to paint the neighbor's fence with his son David. The neighbor was traveling. George bought the wrong color. The fence came out dark gray instead of light blue. David was 12 and had noticed. "Dad, that's the wrong color," he said. George paused for a moment. "You're right," he said. He said nothing else. The next day, he bought the correct paint. He repainted the fence. He told the neighbor what had happened. The neighbor said, "No worries." George said, "No, this won't do," and worked 2 more hours. David Aldrich told this story for years. He said, "My father didn't teach me words to apologize with. He showed me that an apology is an action." In 1958, Albert Bandura from Stanford University published Social Learning Theory. According to Bandura's findings, children acquire moral behaviors largely not through direct instruction, but through observation. How a parent meets a mistake, how they correct it, how they own it, this process builds a lasting schema in the child. And this schema directly shapes how the child manages their own mistakes in later life. Today's parenting hides or justifies mistakes. I was right too, but the conditions were like that. Everyone does it, and the child learns. A mistake is not a responsibility, it is a negotiation. Or a paradox where we first deceive ourselves. George Aldrich bought the right paint and repainted the fence. David saw this, and he owned his mistakes throughout his life and tried to make amends for them. 3. They taught that a job is not left unfinished, not by saying it, but by finishing it. In 1956, Walter Pruitt, who lived in Houston, Texas, began building a barn in the backyard with his son Billy. Billy was 9 years old. On Friday of the second week, Walter fell ill. He had a fever. Before getting out of bed on Saturday, he told his wife, Dorothy, "The barn is unfinished." Dorothy said, "You'll finish it tomorrow." Walter said, "It finishes today." That day, Walter Pruitt went out to the garden with his fever, called his son Billy to his side, and they finished the barn. Billy drove 16 nails, Walter drove 80. That evening, Walter went back to bed, but the barn was complete. Billy Pruitt became a construction engineer years later. In his retirement speech, he said, "Throughout my career, I never left a single job unfinished. I thought for a long time about why this was so. Then I remembered that Saturday, and I understood." Research by Ohio University psychologist Roy Baumeister on self-regulation and completion showed that unfinished jobs create a mental burden and that this burden weakens self-efficacy over time. Conversely, the habit of finishing what one starts built a lasting sense of competence in the child. This feeling came before skill, because skill is learned. But the will to finish a job is born entirely from habit. Today's parenting switches activities when the child loses interest. He doesn't want to, let's not force it. He didn't like this, let's try something else. And the child learns. When it gets hard, you stop. You start something new. And that too stays unfinished. When this child grows up, they fall into that segment of 6 in 10 people that describes modern adults today. Walter Pruitt went out to the garden with his fever, and the barn was finished. Billy didn't leave a single job unfinished for 50 years. Keep going. What I've told you so far were the visible lessons. What comes next are the lessons given without anyone realizing they were teaching. 4. They taught how to stay silent when talking was a luxury. In 1952, Frank Donovan, who lived in Buffalo, New York, would take his son Patrick somewhere every weekend. Sometimes to the market, sometimes to the repair shop, sometimes just for a walk. Patrick was 8 years old and always wanted to talk on these outings. He would ask questions. Frank sometimes answered. Sometimes he didn't. He just walked. One day Patrick asked, "Dad, why do you sometimes not talk at all?" Frank stopped. He looked at Patrick. "Because," he said, "not every thought needs to make a sound." Patrick Donovan became a lawyer in later years. His colleagues said his greatest quality was his capacity to listen. When someone asked him about this, Patrick told them, "My father taught me to be silent, and the man who knows how to be silent also knows how to speak." University of Chicago sociologist David Reisman, in his 1950 work, The Lonely Crowd, used the concept inner-directed to describe the American men of that era. These men operated not from external approval but from internal values. And the most defining quality of this structure was an internal dialogue built through silence, the ability to think without speaking. Today, silence is seen as a problem. Children are trained to fill every gap. There are class participation grades, raise your voice, share your opinion, make a comment. But listening and being silent have become skills that are almost no longer taught. Frank Donovan said, "Not every thought needs to make a sound." And Patrick carried that sentence as the most valuable lesson throughout his career. 5. They taught how to deal with physical pain without dramatizing it. In 1955, Harold Kowalski's son, Danny, who lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was 11 years old. One Saturday morning while working in the garage, he held the hammer wrong and hit his thumb. Danny began to cry. Harold looked at him. The thumb was bruising but not broken. Harold brought a piece of cloth. He wrapped the thumb. "Keep going," he said. Danny kept going. He didn't stop crying right away, but he kept working. They worked in the garage for another hour that day. When Danny sat at the table that evening, Harold said this: "You did good work today." He wasn't talking about injuring his finger. He was talking about continuing to work. Stanford University psychologist Albert Bandura's research on self-efficacy in the 1960s revealed that the capacity to deal with pain and discomfort was directly related to the behaviors modeled in childhood. That is, when a child watched how an adult responded to pain, they internalized that response. A parent who dramatized raised a child who dramatized. A parent who kept going raised a child who kept going. Modern parenting panics at every small injury. It runs to every fall. At every pain it says, it'll pass, and wraps and kisses and soothes. And the child learns. Pain is something to be stopped, not something to be continued through. We exclude parents who genuinely acknowledge when something is truly wrong without dramatizing. Harold Kowalski said, "Keep going." Danny kept going. And that cloth-wrapped thumb became the first lesson in Danny's lifelong habit of always moving forward. 6. They taught how to treat strangers regardless of status. In 1958, George Hartwell, who lived in St. Louis, Missouri, would take his son Arthur to town every weekend. They would go to the grocery store, visit the barber for a shave. George would say the same thing to his son Arthur every time. Make eye contact with everyone. Saying hello doesn't diminish you. One day Arthur didn't greet the butcher's apprentice. The boy was young, wearing a dirty apron. Arthur hadn't noticed him. George stopped him in front of the shop. "Go back," he said, "and say hello." Arthur went back. He said hello. The apprentice was surprised. Arthur Hartwell became the general manager of a large construction firm years later. The rule he was best known for in the company was this: eye contact with everyone, address everyone by name. When he told this to new employees, he would add, "My father taught me this rule in front of a butcher's shop." Harvard University sociologist Elton Mayo's workplace relations research in the 1950s showed that managers who showed respect regardless of status directly increased team commitment and productivity. But this quality wasn't acquired in the workplace. It was developed in childhood. Today, children learn status hierarchy from social media. How many followers, how popular, what kind of life they have. And as status rises, the depth of observation diminishes. George Hartwell sent his son back, made him say hello. And Arthur never forgot that boy in the dirty apron. What do you think could this respectful gesture be on the verge of disappearing today? I need to stop for a moment now, because I need to be honest. I too once thought lessons like these were outdated. Compassion, not severity, conversation, not punishment, dialogue, not authority. These seemed much more right. And these fathers seemed to not understand their sons rather than push them. I was wrong. These weren't harsh fathers. These were clear fathers. And there is a lifetime of difference between clarity and harshness. And these fathers carried the right behaviors and the genetic codes within their DNA. Although these genetic codes were taught from father to son, there is actually only one correct way. Harold Fenwick opened the curtains and said, "You have 10 minutes." George Aldrich repainted the fence. Walter Pruitt went out to the garden with his fever. None of them had long conversations with their sons. None of them explained emotional processes. They just did one thing, and their sons watched. Observation is the most powerful form of teaching. Social learning theory proved this in 1958, but these fathers already knew it in 1953. I understood this too late, and for that late understanding, my son paid the price. Not only me. 7. They taught how to show respect to an elder. In 1953, Frank Calloway, who lived in Indianapolis, Indiana, would introduce his son Eddie to the neighboring elderly couple after church every Sunday. Harold and Ruth Gibson. Both were in their 80s. Eddie was 9 years old and found these conversations boring. One day Frank noticed something. Eddie said hello, but his eyes were looking elsewhere. That evening Frank said to Eddie, "Mr. Gibson fought in the Pacific for 2 years in World War II, and yesterday you shook his hand without looking at him." Eddie went the next Sunday and looked at Mr. Gibson, really looked. And Mr. Gibson told him something no one had ever told him before. Eddie became a history teacher in later years. What he always said was, "The best history book is in the eyes of an old man, but to see it, you first have to look." American household research conducted in 1957 showed that in families where intergenerational communication was strongest, children's empathy capacity and social maturity were significantly higher than their peers. These studies also showed something else. This empathy wasn't taught. It was formed through modeling and expectation. Modern children hear respect for elders as a rule. Respect your elders is said, but why? This question is not answered, and a rule without an answer is very quickly forgotten. Frank Calloway told his son about Mr. Gibson's past, and Eddie looked at that past, and what he saw changed his life. 8. They taught the difference between being afraid of something and running from it. In 1956, Harold Sinclair's son Mark, who lived in Sacramento, California, was 11 years old and was afraid of dogs. There was a large German Shepherd in the neighborhood. Mark took a detour every day to avoid that street on his way to school, Harold noticed. One Saturday morning he said, "Today we are going through that street." Mark said, "I don't want to." Harold said, "I know," and he got up. They went through. The dog barked. Mark stopped. Harold stopped. The dog went quiet. They continued. When they returned to the door, Harold said one thing: "Being afraid is normal. Running away is not." University of Pennsylvania psychologist Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness showed that avoidance behavior enlarges the feared object over time. That is, the more Mark avoided that street, the bigger a threat the dog became in his mind. In contrast, in situations where avoidance was prevented and confrontation with the object was enabled, the large majority of children brought their fear to a manageable scale. Modern parenting tries to eliminate fear. That street is not taken. Distance is kept from that situation, and the child learns it is possible to run from fear, even natural. Harold Sinclair said, "Fear is normal, running away is not." And Mark walked through that street that day, and for the rest of his life, he ran from nothing. 9. They taught what it means to do a job well, not for money, but because it needs to be completed. In 1954, Robert Fenwick, who lived in Cleveland, Ohio, received an offer for his son Daniel to work in the neighbor's garden that summer. Daniel was 10 years old. The neighbor would pay $1 a week. Daniel accepted and worked for 2 weeks. In the third week, the neighbor pointed out a corner Daniel had left without trimming. Daniel said, "I didn't see that part." Robert stepped in. "See it now," he said, "and finish it." Daniel finished it, without taking any money. That evening, Robert said this to his son: "Who will see that corner? The neighbor? Maybe. But you will see it, and you are always there." Robert Fenwick didn't explain work ethics to his son. He just pointed to that corner and said, "You are always there." In 1959, American psychologist Abraham Maslow, in research on self-actualization, emphasized that intrinsic motivation could develop independent of external reward, but that for this to happen, completion satisfaction experiences in early childhood were critically important. In other words, children who knew that some things need to be finished not for money but for the sake of finishing showed far stronger work discipline in adulthood. Today, every success is reinforced with a reward. You did it, you get something. You finished it, you earned something. And the child learns, if there's no reward, why do it? Robert Fenwick showed his son the unfinished corner. Daniel finished it. He didn't get paid. And the satisfaction, that feeling that came after it, nourished Daniel's 50-year career. 10. They taught a man how to look at the world without a single word. And this brings us back to Harold Fenwick, Columbus, Ohio. 1953, that October morning. Harold opened the curtains. Thomas squinted. Harold said, "I'll be waiting in the garden. You have 10 minutes," and left. What did Thomas go to the garden to do that morning? He didn't do anything. Harold was simply standing there. He said nothing. He just waited. Thomas came to him. Harold raised his head. The two of them looked at the garden together. Then Harold turned and went inside. Thomas told this scene to his son decades later. He said, "My father taught me nothing that morning, but he taught me everything. You will get up, you will come, you will look, and then you will keep going. You will get up, you will come, you will look, and then you will keep going." These 4 ideas are the essence of everything that needs to be taught to a son before the age of 12. They taught keeping your word because they kept theirs. They taught owning mistakes because they owned theirs. They taught finishing the job because they finished theirs. They taught silence because they were silent themselves. They taught continuing through pain because they continued themselves. None of them wrote a textbook. None of them gave a speech. None of them offered long explanations to their children. They simply did, and their children watched. Today, modern parenting explains everything. It puts every lesson into words. It places every value into a curriculum. And children listen, but cannot see, because there is nothing to see. Nobody is showing. They don't see the behavior they are supposed to model themselves after. The modern education system prepares social-emotional learning modules. There are responsibility workshops. There are empathy classes. And despite all of this, the number of 12-year-olds who still cannot own their mistakes, cannot keep the promises they make, who leave jobs unfinished is rising. Because these lessons cannot be told, they must be shown. Harold Fenwick opened the curtains, said, "You have 10 minutes," and left. That's all. This was not a lesson. This was a father. Subscribe to Frank. These stories need to be told before they are lost, because one day a child will look to you, and in that moment, what will matter is not how much you explained, but what you did. Harold Fenwick's Garden, Columbus, 1953. Father waiting, son coming. Everything was that simple.